Ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves in a spectacle, part courtroom drama, part ideological chess match. The lawsuit is framed not as legal grievance, but as a referendum on expertise, on Enlightenment values themselves. When rhetoric trumps reason, we risk recasting facts as opinions. The deeper question is not who wins, but what becomes of truth when institutions become battlegrounds. Ideological polarization over academic freedom is one of the most pressing intellectual and cultural challenges of our time. At its core, it is not merely a political disagreement, but a fundamental clash over the values that should guide institutions of higher learning. Places that have long been celebrated as bastions of free thought, rigorous inquiry, and open debate. The polarization that now infects discourse surrounding academic freedom reflects a deeper cognitive and cultural divide, competing visions of what universities are for, who should speak within them, and what counts as legitimate knowledge. On one side, there is a vision grounded in classical liberal principles of open inquiry, the marketplace of ideas, and the assumption that truth emerges not from authority, but from the contest of diverse perspectives. This vision treats academic freedom as sacrosanct, recognizing that even unpopular or controversial views have a place in intellectual ecosystems. It relies on the assumption that students, scholars, and citizens benefit from exposure to challenging, even offensive, ideas. Suppression of speech is seen not only as authoritarian, but also as intellectually impoverishing. It treats the university as a place where ideas stand or fall based on evidence, reasoning, and dialogue, not conformity or moral purity. On the other side lies a newer, more activist vision, one that sees academic institutions not merely as neutral grounds for inquiry, but as instruments for social justice and equity. From this perspective, the historical legacy of exclusion, marginalization, and structural inequality within academia must be actively countered. That often involves restricting the presence or amplification of views deemed harmful, regressive, or rooted in systems of power. Proponents of this view argue that some speech is not just wrong but dangerous, that giving platforms to certain ideas or individuals reifies oppression and causes real harm to vulnerable communities. From this angle, academic freedom must be balanced, even subordinated, to the moral imperative of inclusion and justice. This polarization becomes particularly acute when one faction's commitment to open dialogue is seen by the other as complicity in harm. The classical liberal stance may be interpreted as naïve at best or indifferent to suffering at worst. Meanwhile, the activist approach can be viewed as authoritarian and anti-intellectual by those who fear ideological conformity. The result is not simply disagreement, but mutual incomprehension. Each side often sees the other as not just mistaken, but dangerous. The Harvard lawsuit, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a legal battle and more a symbolic front in a larger ideological war. The lawsuit alleges ideological bias, favoritism, and politicization within academia, claims that resonate with a broader narrative that universities have become echo chambers hostile to conservative or dissenting views. The response from defenders of institutional practices tends to emphasize the importance of combating misinformation, protecting marginalized voices, and fostering inclusive learning environments. Neither side denies the importance of truth or learning. They differ profoundly on how best to achieve those ends. The polarization also manifests in the epistemological assumptions each camp holds. The classical liberal model emphasizes individual cognition, rational debate, and the contestation of ideas as the path to knowledge. It rests on Enlightenment ideals of reason, evidence, and progress through discourse. The opposing view often incorporates insights from postmodern and critical theories, which challenge the objectivity of knowledge itself. From this angle, what is considered truth is shaped by power relations and social constructs. Therefore, curating the discourse is not censorship but correction, a recalibration toward justice. Such epistemological rifts are not merely abstract. They manifest in hiring practices, curriculum design, speaker invitations, and institutional policies. The question of who gets to speak, teach, or publish becomes a flashpoint. Is it more important to protect intellectual diversity or to shield students from potentially harmful ideas? Can both be done simultaneously? These questions are rarely answered without controversy because they rest on competing premises about the purpose and limits of academic freedom. Political polarization in the wider culture exacerbates this divide. Academia does not exist in a vacuum. It reflects and magnifies societal tensions. As political identities become more entrenched, the expectation that universities act as neutral arbiters becomes increasingly untenable. Each ideological side expects institutions to reflect its own values. For some, this means purging woke ideology. For others, it means rooting out what they perceive as systemic racism, sexism, or transphobia embedded in traditional academic norms. The media plays a significant role in amplifying this divide. High-profile cases, such as controversial speaker disinvitations, faculty firings, or lawsuits, are often reported in starkly polarized terms. Right-leaning outlets tend to highlight censorship, groupthink, and the decline of Western intellectual traditions. Left-leaning commentators emphasize structural inequalities, historical context, and the lived experiences of marginalized students. In this media environment, nuance is sacrificed, each side is caricatured, and the space for genuine intellectual engagement narrows. One particularly troubling consequence of this polarization is the chilling effect it produces. Faculty may self-censor, avoiding controversial topics in their research or teaching. Students may be reluctant to express dissenting views in class discussions or papers. The fear is not just of institutional sanction, but of social ostracism, online harassment, or career repercussions. This undermines the very ethos of higher education, which depends on the free exchange of ideas to generate knowledge and foster intellectual growth. Moreover, the institutional response to these pressures is often muddled. University administrations, caught between activist demands and accusations of censorship, may issue contradictory policies or ambiguous statements. The result is confusion and mistrust on all sides. Policies intended to clarify standards around speech and conduct are seen either as too weak or overly punitive. The ambiguity feeds suspicion that decisions are guided not by principle, but by public relations concerns or ideological allegiance. Alumni donors and trustees add another layer to the conflict. As universities increasingly rely on external funding, they must navigate the ideological expectations of those who contribute financially. Some donors expect institutions to resist what they see as radicalism, while others support progressive initiatives and demand stronger action on diversity and inclusion. The university becomes not only a site of ideological struggle among students and faculty, but also among stakeholders whose visions for higher education diverge sharply. This ideological polarization is further intensified by generational change. Younger generations tend to be more progressive, more attuned to issues of identity, equity, and systemic injustice. Older generations may prioritize free speech, viewpoint diversity, and intellectual resilience. These differing priorities are often cast not merely as disagreements, but as signs of moral or intellectual decay. Critics lament the fragility of students, activists decry the persistence of oppressive structures. Dialogue becomes difficult when the parties involved do not share a common frame of reference. In the context of the Harvard lawsuit, these tensions come to a head. Is the lawsuit an attempt to defend intellectual diversity and resist ideological conformity? Or is it a political stunt aimed at undermining progressive academic norms? The answer depends, in large part, on which ideological lens one uses. The legal arguments may revolve around fairness, discrimination, or procedural integrity, but the cultural stakes are far higher. The case becomes a proxy for broader anxieties about the direction of American higher education and, by extension, the intellectual future of liberal democracy itself. Truth versus political narrative is a conflict that has increasingly shaped contemporary intellectual, cultural, and institutional debates, especially in moments where legal, academic, or governmental authority intersects with public opinion and ideological agendas. At the heart of this tension lies the question of whether truth is an objective reality discoverable through reason and evidence, or a contested terrain shaped by social power, political alignment, and strategic communication. When institutions that traditionally serve as arbiters of truth, such as universities, courts, or the press, become entangled in political narratives, the public's ability to distinguish fact from interpretation becomes severely compromised. The rise of political narratives that prioritize identity, loyalty, or ideological symbolism over empirical reality reflects a broader epistemological shift. Increasingly, people interpret facts not as neutral data points but as weapons in a cultural battle. The same event, a lawsuit, a university admission decision, a public statement, can be framed in entirely different ways depending on which political narrative it serves. Each side claims to be defending the truth while accusing the other of distortion. As a result, truth itself becomes politicized, filtered through the lens of partisanship and tribal allegiance rather than assessed on the basis of independent verification. This situation is not entirely new. Throughout history, regimes and movements have tried to bend truth to fit ideology. What's different now is the scale and speed with which such distortions can propagate, thanks to digital media ecosystems that reward outrage, simplify complexity, and algorithmically reinforce confirmation bias. In such an environment, political narrative doesn't merely accompany truth. It often replaces it. Claims once requiring substantial evidence now need only a compelling storyline and a receptive audience. Assertions become truths by repetition rather than validation, and dissent becomes heresy rather than hypothesis. Within academia, this tension is especially fraught. Universities are traditionally seen as the custodians of truth, institutions that prize objectivity, skepticism, and methodological rigor. Yet they are also deeply embedded in the social world, staffed by individuals with values, ideologies, and political beliefs. The clash occurs when the epistemic norms of academia, evidence, reason, falsifiability, are seen to conflict with or be subordinated to prevailing narratives. Scholars who question the dominant orthodoxy, even with rigorous data and logic, may find themselves labeled as politically suspect. At the same time, claims that align with a politically resonant narrative may be elevated despite weak empirical grounding, simply because they affirm the moral instincts of a particular group. This inversion creates a dangerous feedback loop. Political actors begin to see academia not as a neutral space but as a battleground, a place where truths must be policed and narratives enforced. Lawsuits, such as the one involving Trump and Harvard, are not only legal disputes but opportunities to question the legitimacy of academic institutions. From the perspective of the plaintiffs, the case may be framed as a fight against ideological bias and the corruption of truth by political agendas. From the other side, it may be seen as an effort to impose external, partisan control on institutions that are attempting to grapple with their own histories and responsibilities. In both cases, truth becomes secondary to the battle over who gets to define reality. The role of language in this battle is also critical. Terms like woke, cancel culture, systemic racism, free speech, or misinformation are not merely descriptors, they are narrative signifiers deployed to signal allegiance or opposition. Their meanings are fluid, often strategically ambiguous, allowing speakers to invoke them in ways that reinforce their own political narratives while undermining their opponents. Language that once served analytical purposes becomes a tool for emotional mobilization and ideological branding. This weaponization of language further destabilizes the pursuit of truth, turning dialogue into a contest of slogans rather than a process of understanding. In this landscape, truth-seeking becomes increasingly adversarial. Those who aim to conduct balanced, dispassionate inquiry may find themselves distrusted by both sides. To one camp, they may appear insufficiently committed to justice, to the other insufficiently resistant to ideology. The space for moderate, evidence-based positions narrows as public discourse becomes more binary, forcing individuals to align with prepackaged narratives rather than engage in complex reasoning. Intellectual honesty becomes a liability, and the incentives shift from discovering the truth to defending one's team. The consequences for democratic society are profound. A shared commitment to truth, however imperfectly realized, has historically served as a foundation for civil debate, policy deliberation, and collective decision-making. When that foundation erodes, consensus becomes impossible. Citizens retreat into epistemic silos, each with their own set of facts, experts, and explanations. Disagreement no longer means differing interpretations of shared evidence. It means inhabiting entirely separate realities. The possibility of resolving disputes through dialogue or compromise diminishes, as each side believes the other is not merely wrong, but deluded or deceitful. In such a climate, even scientific and legal findings are not immune. Scientific consensus on issues like climate change, public health, or education policy is dismissed by some as politically motivated, while others weaponize science to shut down legitimate skepticism. Legal rulings are celebrated or condemned not based on their reasoning, but on their political utility. When the legitimacy of knowledge-producing institutions is contingent on their alignment with a narrative, the very process of inquiry is undermined. Scholars are pressured to reach the correct conclusions. Judges are accused of bias, and journalists are dismissed as propagandists. The distinction between truth and spin collapses under the weight of narrative warfare. The Harvard case functions as a microcosm of this broader conflict. It presents itself as a matter of law, but it quickly becomes entangled in the symbolic stakes of the culture war. Is Harvard an institution that upholds fairness and academic integrity, or one that enforces ideological conformity? Is the lawsuit a defense of individual rights and intellectual diversity, or a cynical effort to dismantle efforts toward social equity? Each answer depends less on legal detail and more on the political story one tells. The facts of the case are interpreted through the prism of identity, loyalty, and moral judgment rather than neutral analysis. This substitution of narrative for truth also affects how institutions respond. Universities, under pressure to maintain legitimacy, often adopt strategies that are more performative than substantive, issuing statements, changing language, establishing task forces, without engaging in deep reflection or transparent communication. These responses may placate some critics while fueling suspicion among others. The performative aspect of institutional life mirrors the narrative-driven discourse of politics. The goal becomes managing optics, not illuminating truth. This creates cynicism among students, faculty, and the public, who begin to see institutional rhetoric as hollow, calculated, or insincere. Social media accelerates the problem. In a landscape where attention is currency, the most provocative or emotionally resonant narratives dominate. Nuanced discussions are drowned out by viral sound bites, and the architecture of platforms favors partisanship over complexity. Debates that might have been conducted thoughtfully in classrooms or academic journals are now played out in 280 characters, stripped of context and distorted by the demand for immediacy. In this environment, truth must compete with spectacle, and it rarely wins. Even the concept of truth itself comes under attack. Critical perspectives that question the objectivity of knowledge can be opted into a nihilistic relativism where every claim is seen as equally valid or equally suspect. While such critiques can be valuable in highlighting the influence of culture, power, and bias in knowledge production, they can also be weaponized to justify rejection of inconvenient facts. This creates a paradox. The more we talk about truth, the less agreement we have on what it means or how to find it. The search for truth is replaced by a struggle over whose narrative prevails. Institutional credibility under scrutiny is a defining feature of the current moment in higher education, governance, media, and public life. Institutions that once commanded broad respect and operated as trusted stewards of knowledge, fairness, and authority now face deep skepticism from multiple directions. This erosion of credibility is not accidental. It results from a complex interplay of historical failures, shifting cultural norms, ideological polarization, and the unprecedented velocity of information and misinformation. What was once implicit trust has given way to explicit doubt, and institutions now operate in an environment where their legitimacy must be constantly justified, defended, and re-earned. Universities, in particular, are at the center of this credibility crisis. They are expected to fulfill contradictory roles, to preserve tradition and catalyze progress, to nurture open inquiry while ensuring safety and inclusion, to remain politically neutral while engaging with politically charged subjects. These expectations create inherent tensions. When universities attempt to adapt to social demands by revising curricula, expanding diversity efforts, or taking public stances, they risk accusations of political partisanship. Conversely, if they resist these changes, they are charged with being complicit in structural inequities or intellectual stagnation. Each move is interpreted not just as an academic decision, but as a political signal. This intensifies scrutiny from a range of actors. Political figures use institutions as rhetorical battlegrounds, framing them either as heroic defenders of justice or as corrupted tools of ideological indoctrination. Lawsuits, such as those involving elite universities and affirmative action policies or ideological bias, become symbolic confrontations. They are not merely about admissions standards or faculty hiring procedures, but about broader narratives of fairness, meritocracy, discrimination, and national identity. The courtroom becomes a stage on which deeper anxieties about societal values are performed and amplified. Internal dynamics also contribute to the crisis. Faculty and administrators must navigate increasingly complex governance challenges in a climate of suspicion. Accusations of hypocrisy, inconsistency, or self-interest circulate rapidly, and administrative decisions are often met with backlash from some segment of the campus community. If an institution disciplines a faculty member for controversial speech, it risks violating academic freedom. If it refrains, it may be accused of endorsing harmful views. These dilemmas are rarely resolved to universal satisfaction and often leave lasting damage to institutional trust. The rise of transparency culture further complicates institutional life. While transparency is generally seen as a virtue, it also exposes institutions to relentless scrutiny and misinterpretation. Internal emails, meeting minutes, funding sources, and policy drafts are mined for evidence of bias, inconsistency, or ulterior motives. Rather than facilitating understanding, this kind of hyper-transparency can generate a climate of suspicion and defensive bureaucracy. Institutions become more risk-averse, more focused on messaging than on substance, and less able to respond nimbly or creatively to challenges. Media coverage amplifies these dynamics. Institutional controversies that might once have remained local now become national stories within hours. A speaker being disinvited, a student protest, or a controversial hiring decision can be transformed into a symbolic flashpoint. Headlines flatten complexity into conflict. Narratives are constructed quickly and stick long after the underlying facts have been corrected or contextualized. Institutions find themselves managing perception more than engaging with genuine reform or reflection. Public relations strategies take precedence over intellectual clarity or pedagogical integrity. Credibility also suffers when institutions are perceived as inconsistent, if academic standards appear to shift based on political convenience, or if certain viewpoints are disproportionately sanctioned or protected. The appearance of fairness is undermined. Credibility depends not just on being right, but on being seen to apply standards evenly. Once selective enforcement is perceived, whether real or exaggerated, trust erodes. Individuals begin to suspect that institutional norms are not grounded in principle but in ideology. This perception fuels disengagement, cynicism, and alternative epistemologies that flourish in the absence of trusted authorities. The increasing influence of external stakeholders further pressures institutional credibility. Donors, politicians, advocacy groups, and alumni often hold conflicting visions of what an institution should be. Their financial or political leverage can shape decisions about curricula, hiring, public statements, and strategic direction. When these pressures become visible, institutions are accused of selling out their mission or capitulating to power. The ideal of institutional autonomy becomes harder to uphold in a context where every decision must be weighed against possible backlash from constituencies with divergent interests and ideologies. Accreditation bodies, government agencies, and legal institutions also participate in this credibility matrix. When courts intervene in university practices, or when legislative bodies seek to regulate academic content, the authority of academic institutions is implicitly questioned. This produces a defensive posture where universities must assert their independence while complying with external mandates. The resulting tension invites further scrutiny and reinforces the idea that institutions are politically entangled, bureaucratically compromised, or intellectually compromised. Students, once seen primarily as learners, now increasingly view themselves as stakeholders with rights, expectations, and the capacity to demand institutional change. This shift reflects broader generational and cultural changes, including greater awareness of historical injustices, mental health, and identity politics. Institutions that fail to respond to these concerns are seen as out of touch or even hostile. Yet over-accommodation can be viewed as pandering or as compromising academic rigor. Balancing responsiveness with pedagogical coherence is a challenge that directly affects institutional credibility. Faculty, too, experience a credibility crisis. As their role shifts from public intellectuals and researchers to increasingly burdened service providers in an administrative system, their authority is diluted. The erosion of tenure, the rise of adjunctification, and the expansion of compliance obligations reduce academic freedom and intellectual autonomy. When faculty feel disempowered or distrusted, morale suffers. When students perceive faculty as ideological actors rather than neutral experts, the educational mission is undermined. Trust must flow in multiple directions, and when any link in this chain is weakened, institutional credibility falters. Technology adds another layer of complexity. Online learning, digital platforms, and artificial intelligence reshape how knowledge is transmitted and evaluated. The traditional classroom is no longer the sole site of learning, and universities are no longer the gatekeepers of information. This democratization of knowledge challenges institutional authority. When a YouTube personality or independent blogger can reach millions with persuasive, if not always accurate, content, the university's role as an epistemic authority must be justified anew. Institutions can no longer rely on prestige alone. They must actively earn trust in a marketplace of ideas that is decentralized, fast-moving, and often hostile. Historical reckoning also plays a role. Many institutions are now publicly confronting their past complicity in slavery, colonialism, or exclusion. While these efforts at transparency and reconciliation are commendable, they also open institutions to critique and reinterpretation. The past becomes not a source of stability but of contention. Symbolic gestures such as renaming buildings or issuing apologies may satisfy some while angering others who view such actions as insufficient or performative. Navigating this terrain requires moral clarity, institutional memory, and genuine engagement, all of which are difficult to sustain amid constant external pressure. The cumulative effect of these dynamics is a pervasive atmosphere of doubt. People look to institutions not with deference but with suspicion. Authority is presumed to be self-serving until proven otherwise. In such an environment, credibility is fragile, contingent, and often transactional. It is not inherited or granted, but must be continuously demonstrated. A single misstep can undo years of trust building. A poorly handled controversy can become emblematic of deeper perceived flaws. The metrics by which credibility is judged are not always fair or consistent, but they are powerful and often unforgiving. Even institutional successes can become sources of scrutiny. High rankings, endowment growth, or prestige can provoke resentment or allegations of elitism. Efforts to expand access or modernize curriculum can be dismissed as dilution or politicization. Institutions are caught in a paradox where visibility invites criticism and invisibility risks irrelevance. They must engage, explain, defend, and adapt, all while staying true to their core values, which themselves are often contested. Credibility, in this sense, is not a static attribute, but an ongoing negotiation between values, performance, and perception. The polarization of intellectual culture has created a climate where dialogue is often replaced by declaration, and where the very idea of open debate is viewed with suspicion. Once a domain where complexity, ambiguity, and rigorous exchange were embraced, intellectual culture has increasingly bifurcated into opposing camps, each with its own ideological orthodoxies, moral vocabularies, and epistemic filters. This divide is not merely political in nature. It is epistemological, shaping how people define knowledge, authority, and even reality itself. In this polarized atmosphere, inquiry becomes entangled with identity, and the quest for understanding is often subordinated to the imperative of affiliation. One of the most visible symptoms of this polarization is the transformation of disagreement into heresy. When intellectual camps become insular, any challenge to prevailing norms is treated not as a contribution to the discourse, but as a betrayal of group loyalty. Individuals who raise inconvenient questions or present data that contradicts dominant narratives risk being cast out, stigmatized, or silenced. The result is a form of intellectual tribalism, where allegiance matters more than argument, and where consensus is often enforced rather than earned. Intellectual humility is viewed as weakness, and complexity is sacrificed for clarity that flatters the group's moral self-image. Social media accelerates this process, rewarding ideological purity and punishing deviation. The performative nature of online discourse incentivizes expressions of outrage, certainty, and condemnation rather than curiosity, nuance, or doubt. Thought becomes spectacle, and intellectual identity is built not through careful argumentation, but through visible alignment with the correct positions. The like and retweet become substitutes for peer review, and reputational capital is accumulated through performative allegiance rather than substantive contribution. In such a system, polarization is not a side effect. It is the mechanism by which attention and status are distributed. Within academia, polarization has altered the intellectual ecosystem. Fields that were once unified by a shared commitment to methodological rigor now often fracture along ideological lines. Scholars gravitate toward conferences, journals, and networks that affirm their worldview. Funding opportunities and publication prospects may be influenced by the political implications of a research agenda, subtly shaping what questions are asked and which answers are welcomed. This creates echo chambers, where certain ideas flourish not because they are better supported by evidence, but because they resonate with the prevailing sensibilities of the group. Dissenting voices are not necessarily excluded overtly, but the costs of expressing them, professional, social, emotional, can be high enough to ensure silence. This intellectual segregation also affects students, who are often exposed to a limited spectrum of perspectives. In environments where certain viewpoints are stigmatized or absent altogether, students may be denied the opportunity to engage with arguments they will inevitably encounter outside the academy. This leaves them intellectually underprepared and fosters a fragile confidence that collapses in the face of serious challenge. Worse, it encourages a defensive posture, where disagreement is interpreted as threat, and the goal of education shifts from exploration to affirmation. The university, once a space for intellectual risk-taking, becomes a zone of epistemic safety. Polarization also redefines the boundaries of free speech. In principle, the protection of speech implies the willingness to tolerate ideas we find disturbing, offensive, or wrong. But in a polarized culture, tolerance is often reserved for those within one's own camp, while opponents are subjected to scrutiny and sanction. The line between critique and cancellation becomes blurry, and the motives behind speech are treated as more important than its content. This results in selective advocacy, where calls for open discourse are weaponized or dismissed depending on whose speech is at stake. Free speech becomes a partisan issue rather than a universal principle. This shift has implications beyond the campus or intellectual scene. When intellectual polarization bleeds into journalism, public policy, and education, it undermines the possibility of shared understanding. Public debates become hostile encounters, where participants talk past each other using incompatible languages of value and evidence. Common ground erodes, and disagreement is no longer about how to interpret facts, but about which facts are admissible. Each side constructs its own version of reality, populated with its own experts, data, and narratives. In such a fragmented environment, consensus becomes unattainable and democratic deliberation becomes performative rather than productive. The consequences for expertise are significant. In a polarized climate, experts are often perceived not as neutral arbiters of knowledge, but as ideological actors. Their authority is accepted or rejected based on perceived affiliation rather than demonstrated competence. This delegitimization of expertise fuels public skepticism toward science, law, journalism, and academia. People are no longer persuaded by credentials or evidence, but by whether the speaker affirms their pre-existing worldview. The intellectual becomes the partisan, and the pursuit of truth is replaced by the performance of allegiance. This undermines not only trust in institutions, but the very mechanisms by which society evaluates knowledge claims. Polarization also influences how historical narratives are constructed and contested. Competing camps offer incompatible accounts of the past, each emphasizing different events, figures, and interpretations. History becomes a battleground for present-day identity politics, and the past is used to justify contemporary agendas rather than illuminate complexity. In this context, public monuments, curricula, and commemorations become flashpoints for ideological struggle. The result is not greater historical awareness, but a deeper entrenchment of division, where learning from the past becomes secondary to affirming the righteousness of one's cause. Art and literature are not immune to this dynamic. Creative works are increasingly judged not by aesthetic or intellectual merit, but by their political alignment. Novels, films, and artworks are scrutinized for ideological purity, and artists are praised or condemned based on their perceived affiliations. This moralization of culture limits imagination and discourages experimentation. It reduces art to messaging and transforms the cultural landscape into a theater of political signaling. In such an atmosphere, genuine innovation becomes risky, and the capacity of art to challenge, unsettle, or transcend ideology is diminished. Even interpersonal relationships are shaped by polarization. Families, friendships, and professional networks strain under the pressure of political and ideological discord. People curate their social lives to avoid conflict, often resulting in homogenized communities where disagreement is rare and conformity is tacitly expected. This further reinforces echo chambers and reduces the opportunity for intellectual growth. The personal becomes political in a way that narrows rather than expands human experience. The capacity to disagree respectfully or to engage across lines of difference becomes increasingly rare, and polarization seeps into the very fabric of daily life. Education, which should be the antidote to intellectual polarization, often becomes complicit in its spread. Curricula that prioritize ideological conformity over intellectual diversity risk creating environments where students are trained to recite rather than reason. Classrooms become spaces of performance rather than inquiry, and the Socratic ideal of dialogue gives way to monologue. The skills most needed for a pluralistic society, critical thinking, empathetic listening, openness to challenge, are sidelined in favor of rhetorical point scoring and moral certitude. This fails both the students and the society that depends on them. Leadership within intellectual institutions is often paralyzed by polarization. Decisions about hiring, curriculum, funding, and public engagement are fraught with political risk. Leaders must navigate competing constituencies, each demanding validation and threatening retaliation. This creates a climate of managerial caution, where bold intellectual leadership is rare and decisions are made to minimize controversy rather than maximize insight. Institutions begin to resemble bureaucracies more than communities of inquiry, and the incentives shift from truth, seeking to risk avoidance. Intellectual courage becomes an outlier trait rather than a shared norm. The long-term impact of intellectual polarization is not only cultural but cognitive. When individuals are consistently exposed to ideologically uniform perspectives, their ability to process opposing information atrophies. Cognitive rigidity replaces flexibility, and motivated reasoning becomes the default mode of thought. People become adept at defending their beliefs, but less capable of revising them. Curiosity declines, empathy narrows, and the capacity for intellectual humility erodes. Polarization thus affects not just what people think, but how they think, reshaping the architecture of thought itself in ways that undermine the foundations of a reflective, democratic society.